We are in week 2 of a teaching series called I Worry About Everything Because I Pray About Nothing. And chances are, I don't need to ask people to raise their hands because I think it would be probably accurate to say that all of us at some point in time have been in that space, right? Where we are worried about everything from our relationships to our marriage to dating to our jobs to finances, where worry and anxiety and fear over the future consume our being, consume our thoughts. And then we're like, oh yeah, I should probably pray about that. Like if we're honest, all of us at some point in time have maybe found ourselves worrying about everything and praying about nothing. And that doesn't make you bad, and that statement isn't meant to make you feel shameful. You're just human, like me. And this series is all about recentering our hearts and our lives on prayer. Not because we believe if you pray, then life will be whimsical and perfect and nothing terrible, difficult will ever happen. If you follow Jesus for more than like 5 minutes, you know that when you follow Jesus, life can still be hard. Can I get an amen on that? And so the notion here is not that if you pray about everything, then you'll have nothing to worry about anymore. The notion here is that if you pray about everything, chances are you will worry less about the things that maybe you normally would worry so much about. See, there's sometimes this misconception that happens in churches, and that misconception is this idea that if you will follow Jesus, then Jesus will make your life better in all ways. And the truth of the matter is, life is still complicated even when you follow Jesus. Marriage is still complicated. Raising kids is still complicated. Dating is still complicated. Finances can still be complicated even after you follow Jesus. I think what is more true than telling you that Jesus will make your life better is that when you follow Jesus, he will make you better at life. Like Jesus actually assures you that if you'll follow him, sometimes following Jesus will actually make your life more complicated. That if you follow Jesus, it will actually sometimes, because you follow Jesus, make your life more difficult. So the promise isn't follow Jesus and life will be better. The promise is follow Jesus and you'll get better at life. And that is what prayer does. Prayer helps us get a little bit better at navigating the nuances and complexities and complications and difficulties that life will often throw our way. And so this series, we're really, really trying to recenter and maybe even reimagine or maybe return back to what it actually means to pray and why it's so important for our lives. Last week, we talked about the point of prayer. And for many of us, if I were to ask you what the point of prayer is, your answer might sound something like this: I pray for God. So it's more of like a religious activity. I do this for God because, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Maybe you were raised in a very religious household and you were told that you just need to pray. And it really wasn't about relationship. It was about religion. It's about checking a box. And maybe you were told to pray a certain way, a certain amount of times, at a certain place, at a certain time. And if you checked all those boxes, then God gave you the thumbs up. But if you didn't, then you're a little worried about what God thinks about you in that moment. And so prayer is really this thing you do for God. For others of you, maybe prayer isn't something you do for God, but maybe prayer is something that you do to get something from God. Like if we read the transcripts of your prayer, then I wonder if maybe for some of us, we would discover that prayer is something ultimately that we do to get something from God. We come to God, we give him our laundry list of needs. He is sort of like our spiritual Santa Claus. Like we just kind of hop on his lap, tell him what we want, and then we move on with our lives. And so we have like our prayer space here, and then we have the rest of our life, because prayer to some people is really just about getting something from God. But last week we talked about how really the heart and point of prayer, it's not to do something for God, and the heart and point of prayer is not to get something from God, but ultimately the point of prayer is to do life with God. It's to do life with God, because when you read the scriptures, there's one thing that just becomes so clear, and that is that God is obsessed with being with people. From the first book of the Bible in Genesis to the last in Revelation, you get this sense that God has no desire to be distant or disconnected from people, but desires to be intimate and walk with people, to be near people, to be with people. In fact, this is why Jesus' name was Emmanuel, God with us, because that is what God is after all along, to be with you. Yes, he's infinite, but he's incredibly intimate as well. What's that noise? I don't know what that is, but we'll pretend that's normal. Okay. And so the point of prayer is first and foremost to be with God. Prayer is not, and if you're taking notes today, it might be worth writing this down. Prayer is not a religious activity, it's a relational one. And until you understand that prayer is a relational activity, not really a religious activity, prayer will always sort of not make a whole lot of sense. Or prayer might feel like it's quote unquote working, but at some point you'll run out of steam because Jesus didn't come to this earth, live and die to give you a religion. And I know that might sound weird or surprising coming from a guy like me in a place like this, but Jesus didn't die to start a religion. He died to offer to all humanity relationship. And when you get this, when you understand this, and when you believe this, not just here, but in your heart, it transforms how you approach prayer completely. And so last week we talked all about this, the point of prayer. You can watch it on our YouTube channel. I'd encourage you to do so. I think it's such a foundational teaching if you want to understand what prayer is really about. But today I want to talk about that. Not only is prayer about a relationship, but prayer, when you understand it in this light, has the capacity to sort of reset your heart and soul. That when you pray, it's an opportunity to reset and to recenter your heart and soul. And I want to talk about how we can do this today. How we can begin to approach prayer as a way to not only draw close to this God who's drawing close to us, but to also show up in prayer and allow it to reset our hearts. Have you ever been working on a project on your computer? Maybe you're writing your thesis or an essay. Maybe you are working on a video that you're editing, or you are working on your deck that you're creating for this pitch that you're going to give to your boss the next day. And have you ever been in this space that you've been working and working and working, and then there's this small little voice that says, you should probably save that by now. That speaks to you in the back of your mind. I don't know if you've ever sensed that voice. It's like, might be a good time to save. But I don't know if you're anything like me. Whenever I hear that small, subtle voice, which I think is probably the Holy Spirit, I tend to ignore it. And I tend to be like, no, I'm in a good rhythm. I don't want to break my rhythm, and I refuse to save my project. And every single time I ignore that little internal voice that says, you should probably save your project, all of a sudden my computer comes to a grinding halt, and I am taunted by this familiar icon that many of you probably know, because this icon is responsible for many of you losing your faith, not only in technology, not only in humanity, but this little icon has caused maybe some of you to lose your faith in the goodness of God himself. Because you've been working and you've been striving and you've put hours into this project, and then this spinning wheel of doom appears on your screen, and you know there's only one option. There's only one thing that you can do that will fix what is going on, and that is to reset your computer. And I don't know why this happens. Somebody much smarter than me probably knows the answer to this, probably someone in this room, so tell me after service. I don't understand why resetting your computer will take your computer that was like at one point gasping for life on its deathbed, and you restart it, and all of a sudden it resurrects back to a fully functioning machine. But you and I both know that when you reset your computer and you restore your computer, not only is your faith in technology restored, but when you open your project and realize you didn't lose everything, your faith in humanity and God himself is restored. And all it came from was a simple reset. And everything was fine, which is super funny because today, if you were late, you missed this. I was not planning it, but it was a real-time metaphor, is our sound system just wasn't working right, and we had to reset the sound system. I was like, this is brilliant. God's making me live the metaphor today. And isn't it funny, though, that sometimes just by simply resetting things, it allows you to recenter and recalibrate a little bit. If only children were that simple, right? Parents in the room, right? If only children had a reset button. And if you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. And if you're a parent, then you're probably familiar with the term the witching hour. Parents in this room, anybody know what the witching hour is? Okay, a couple of you know, and a lot of you don't know, probably because you don't have a kid. So let me tell you what the witching hour is. It is this moment in the day where all of a sudden, your cute little angel of a human becomes possessed by a legion of demons. And they become something that you never thought they could. They are surely not your kid anymore. And if you're a new parent or you eventually become a parent, know this. Before you call the exorcist over, you don't need to do that. Instead, you just need to probably let them take a nap. Because the witching hour typically happens because children are overly tired or overly stimulated. And by just letting them go to sleep, it sort of resets them a little bit. so that by the morning time, they're back to being your little angel. Wouldn't it be nice if life gave you a reset button? Wouldn't it be awesome that when you were born, you were given a reset button that was just for you, that if you hit it, it would reset whatever moment it is that you're in? I mean, come on, how many first dates have some of you been on where you're like, good God, is there a reset button? Is there a get out of here button? Is there an evacuate button? Like that would be nice. Or maybe you started a conversation with your partner, your spouse, or your roommate, and you thought it was gonna be okay, but then the conversation goes sideways quicker than you can handle it, and you're like, reset, how do I reset this? Or some of you, right, you oversleep in your alarm clock, you spill coffee on your white pants, and you miss the bus, and it's only 8:30 in the morning. Don't you just wish, right, that there would just be a reset button to just go back to the very start and try it all over again? And while there is no reset button, as we know, for our circumstances, there's no reset button for our lives, I've found that there is a way that you can actually begin to reset and recenter and recalibrate your heart and your soul. And the way that we're able to do this, I believe, is through prayer. Because there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of bugs that can kind of get into the system of our soul and cause us to lag a little bit. And we need a way to sort of reset and recenter when those situations unfold. And I believe with everything that's in me that prayer is one of the key gifts God has given each and every. All right, there you go. There you go. Can we reset? Don't you wish there was a reset button when the mic dies in the middle of a sermon? Yes. All right, so let's keep going. So I wish there was this reset button, and the truth of the matter is I believe there is for us in our souls and in our hearts. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, I want to be abundantly clear that if you'll just pray, then you just pray loud enough and long enough and hard enough, like you're gonna go from a difficult life to becoming this like rainbow puking unicorn that frolics through all of life for the rest of your days. I'm not suggesting that that is what happens when we pray, but what I am suggesting is that when we pray, it resets and recenters our hearts and helps us not necessarily to avoid pain, but to move through it in a healthy way. But here's what we need to understand if prayer is going to become a reset button for your soul. There's something that I've noticed, and I've been a pastor for 16 years, and so I've been around the church world for a minute, and I've noticed, especially with topics like prayer, that when it comes to prayer, it can be communicated directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, that spiritual health sort of trumps emotional and mental health. But what I want to be clear about today is that I believe God created both your emotional and mental health and spiritual health not to be compartmentalized and separated, but actually for all of those things to be integrated. And so today what I want to talk about, as we talk about what does it look like to sort of reset your heart and soul through prayer, I think a key to this is learning how to integrate your emotional mental health with your spiritual health through prayer. I want to talk about an emotionally healthy way to pray, which of course means there are emotionally unhealthy ways to pray. And we'll also talk about that in a little bit as well. Pete Scazzero, he wrote in a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. He said this, and some of y'all will be able to relate to this, I think. He says, Christian spirituality without an integration of emotional health can be deadly to yourself, your relationship with God, and the people around you. I'm just going to say it again because I want it to sink in. Christian spirituality without an integration of emotional health can be deadly to yourself, your relationship with God, and the people around you. And chances are, if you've been around the church world for some time, maybe you know exactly what he's talking about. Because the church has not always done a very great job of integrating emotional and mental health and spiritual health. It's really only been within like the last 10 years that the conversation around mental health, around therapy, around medicine has become not taboo, but has actually become normalized. That has actually become safe to talk about without feeling ashamed about any of it. I would bet, though, there are some of you, you've been around the church long enough that you've seen maybe churches scoff at the idea of therapy as indicative of a weak faith. That if you just had stronger faith and if you just prayed more and if you really loved God, then you shouldn't need therapy. Or maybe some of you have experienced churches where they'll sort of communicate directly or indirectly that if you really prayed, then you wouldn't need pills. That if you really took care of your soul, then you wouldn't need any of that other stuff. But can I just tell you, as someone who has, especially over the last few years, had to do a lot of work in the arena of my own mental health, I've realized something, and maybe you've realized this before I did. I've realized that even when I have high faith, I can still struggle with low serotonin. Like I could have the highest faith in the world and yet still struggle with low serotonin. Both can be true. And I've realized that seeking good therapy, I need you to hear this because this might just free you from shame that was put on you wrongfully. Seeking good therapy does not mean you have a bad theology. It is not either you seek counsel from man or you seek counsel from God. It is you seek counsel from man and you seek counsel from God. If only the Bible talked a lot about that. And, hopefully you're catching the sarcasm there. It's not either prayer or emotional health. It's prayer and emotional health. It's not prayer or therapy. It's prayer and therapy. It's not prayer or medicine for some of us. For some of us, it's prayer and medicine. For some of us, it's prayer and mindfulness, not prayer or mindfulness. Emotionally healthy prayer embraces the whole journey. If you're taking notes, I want you to write that down. Emotionally healthy prayer embraces the whole journey, which means emotionally unhealthy prayer hides from certain parts of the journey. Emotionally unhealthy prayer will use prayer as a way to avoid what's really going on in your heart, avoid what's really going on in your soul, what's really going on in your mind, what's maybe even really going on in your own biology. When we use prayer as a means to avoid those things, I would argue that's emotionally unhealthy prayer. But emotionally healthy prayer invites your whole story and your whole self to the table. Has anyone here seen the movie Inside Out? It's the best Pixar movie. My man's hand shot straight up. You like that movie, all right. It's a good movie. And it's so powerful because you had joy if you're familiar with the movie, and if you're not familiar with the movie, it's been out a few years. This is your own fault that I'm spoiling it for you. But if you're familiar with it, then you have joy, and joy is just trying to kind of keep sadness at bay. Joy became a frustration, or sadness was a frustration. Sadness seemed like an inconvenience. And by the end of the movie, Joy learned something that we all need to learn if we're going to have emotionally healthy prayer. Sadness belongs. Joy belongs. All the emotions belong because God created emotion. So emotionally healthy prayer invites your whole self and whole story and says it all belongs. Are you with me? So I want to talk about that today. How can you have an emotionally healthy prayer life, a holistic spirituality that embraces the whole journey you are on, and embraces the whole person that you are? And so I want to look at a psalm written by a king of Israel. His name was David. And he wrote this psalm in Psalm chapter 22. And I love David because David, if you know anything about David's story, he has probably the most epic nickname in all of the Bible. His nickname is a man after God's own heart. I don't know about you, but if I got that sort of nickname or you had that sort of nickname, I would assume you are pretty close to perfect, wouldn't you? You would probably assume that anyone that God would name a man after God's own heart would probably have it all together. And that's precisely why I love David, because he's a man after God's own heart and he is a mess. He's a man after God's own heart, but he is a roller coaster of emotions. And David confronts this idea that many of us tend to believe, and that idea that many of us tend to believe is that if our outside world is good, then our inside world was good. But David confronts that because David had everything that everyone thinks you should have to be happy, to enjoy life. He had money, he had fame, he had followers, he had notoriety. He was the man, he was the king of a nation. He had everything that everyone would think you would need to be whole and complete. And yet David was a mess. And we still, even thousands of years later, tend to look at our outer world as the key metric of our inner world. You know how I know this? Because chances are, when I ask you, hey, how are you doing? You will point me to some outer world metric. Oh, I'm doing good. Work's going great. Oh, I'm doing really good. My marriage is strong. Oh, I'm doing really good. I'm finally in a relationship with someone who's not crazy. Oh, I'm doing good. My kids are awesome. They just graduated. Oh, I'm doing really good. I got a promotion at work. I'm making more money. Oh, I'm doing really good because I'm going on a vacation. We tend to answer that question, how are you, by looking at things around us. But who here knows that everything around you could look good while everything within you is a mess? And David is a perfect example of this. And so David in Psalm chapter 22 is a reminder of what it looks like to enter into prayer in an emotionally healthy way, a holistic way that welcomes all of your story and all of your journey to the table. And David provides for us really a framework. I don't want to use the word formula. I know we like formulas, but I really want to actually use the word framework, because this framework I'm going to give you here is not necessarily a formula to having like the best prayer life ever, but it is, I believe, a framework that provides some waypoints on how to have an emotionally healthy and holistic prayer life. And in Psalm chapter 22, David shows us the progression of emotionally healthy prayer, and that progression looks a little bit like this. He said it's 5 points. It's pain, processing, prayer, proclamation, peace. The progression of emotionally healthy prayer looks like this: pain, processing, prayer, it says processing twice. Proclamation, peace. Replace the second processing with proclamation. David shows us a way to have emotionally and holistic prayer life. And I want to walk through these 5 points and these 5 progression points towards emotionally healthy prayer. The first is this. If you're taking notes, if you're a note taker, you're going to love today's talk. The first point is this. It's pain. It's pain. How do we begin to have an emotionally healthy prayer life? The first is this. We got to be willing to bring our complaint, our suffering, our wounds, our baggage, our struggles. We got to bring our sorrow to God. We got to welcome the pain that we're experiencing, the pain that we're carrying into our prayer life, which, by the way, is what David does in Psalm 22. In Psalm chapter 22, verse 1, here's what David says. He starts the entire psalm by saying this: my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night. I find no rest. I mean, who here has prayed that prayer before? Let's be real. Or wanted to pray that prayer. David starts by expressing his pain, his frustration, his sense of abandonment. Like, God, where are you when I need you most? And what's interesting about this psalm in Psalm 22, if you know the story of Jesus and the crucifixion, Jesus, prior to taking his last breath, he echoes Psalm 22, and Jesus himself says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So apparently, both David, a man known as a man after God's own heart, and Jesus, the Son of God, were both willing to express honestly their pain to God. They didn't put a mask on it. They didn't dress it up. They didn't slap some sort of religious platitude of a bumper sticker on it. They didn't take scriptures out of context and say, well, everything happens for a reason. They cried out and they expressed honestly their pain to God. I don't know about you. That kind of comforts me. Like, I don't know about you, but that actually kind of frees me, because if Jesus can express his pain honestly to God, then that means I can too. It means you can as well. In fact, I find it interesting that every gospel author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they record that moment where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's almost like every author is like, that's a key moment. We need that in there. Like, we need to keep that in the story. And I wonder why. Maybe it's because they knew that there were going to be moments that people wondered, can I bring my pain, my struggle, my sense of abandonment, my frustration, my isolation, my anxiety, my depression, can I bring all of me and all of my story to God? And they're like, we need that, because Jesus did just that, giving all of us permission to do the same. And so if Jesus can express his pain to God, then so can we. And this should tell us all something about prayer. And this will change how you pray. What it shows each and every one of us about prayer, and emotionally healthy prayer at that, is that real prayers are holy prayers. Maybe you need to write that down, because you need to remember that. Real prayers are holy prayers. I mean, ever since I started this series on social media and through our email newsletter that we send out each week, I've been kind of asking, hey, share with me some of the struggles you have with prayer. I cannot tell you how many responses I've gotten back that have said pretty much this: I struggle with prayer because I don't know what to say. I struggle with prayer because I don't know, like, what do I say? How formal do I need to be? What can I really say during prayer? Person after person has emailed me or DM'd me and said, Travis, the reason I struggle with prayer is because I don't know how to give this like eloquent King James Version-esque prayer in my times with God. And so because I don't know what to say, I just say nothing at all. I avoid it because it just feels awkward. It feels shameful. I feel like I've been following Jesus. I should know this by now, but I don't know this by now. I don't know what to say. Has anyone ever been there? Like I know many of us have. And this should hopefully free you in your prayer life. Because some of us think holy prayers are eloquent prayers. Some of us think holy prayers are long-winded prayers. Some of us think that holy prayers are those prayers coming from a heart that has no doubts and no struggles and no pain and no frustration with God. Can I tell you today, holy prayers are real prayers. Honest prayers are holy prayers. Which means for some of you, God isn't needing your King James Version prayer. For some of you, God's like, yeah, I'm not like looking for that eloquent prayer that you heard in church. For some of you, the holiest prayer you could pray right now might sound like this. God, are you serious? Maybe for some of you, the holiest prayer you can pray right now is, God, where in the world are you? Maybe some of you, the realest and best and holiest prayer you can pray is, God, I am done. I am at the end of my rope. God, maybe for some of you, the holiest prayer you could pray right now is, God, I am angry at you. In fact, there may be some of you, the reason that you've never really sensed a real authentic time in the presence of God is because you have not been a real authentic presence in the presence of God. That you have been showing up with whatever religious poker face you were convinced you needed to bring when you talk to God. But I'm telling you, honest prayers are holy prayers. And maybe for some of you, the path forward in prayer is just by you being honest with God. And anyone who tells you that God can't handle these prayers, you can just tell them, my pastor says you're wrong. All right? You're wrong. I mean, anyone who says that God cannot handle these sorts of prayers, what they're just saying is their God is really small. I believe God is big enough for your honesty. God is big enough for your frustration. God is big enough for your real prayers, and He is not scandalized by any of it. And if you're like, no, I don't think that's true, read the Psalms. 70% of the Psalms are laments, meaning they're David or the other Psalm writers coming to God, lamenting about life. We have a book called Lamentations. If God wasn't open to lamenting and grieving and frustration, then 70% of the Psalms would be gone, along with the book Lamentations and Ecclesiastes, because that's a downer of a book. If you know, you know. But God is, He's big enough to handle your pain. And maybe the journey towards emotionally healthy prayer begins with you saying, God, here's my pain. Here's my honesty. Here's where I really am. The second is this, it's processing. You have pain and then you have processing. And processing is that part of emotionally healthy prayer where you struggle with the contradictions you're experiencing. That you wade through the waters that, at one point seem still, and then all of a sudden they seem like they're raging all around you. Processing is when you strap yourself in the emotional roller coaster and you invite Jesus to the seat next to you. Processing is such a crucial space, and we see David do just that. David acknowledges he's in a dark place, but David doesn't pitch his tent there. Instead, he processes his feelings by turning to God, which, by the way, this is a key difference between prayer and mindfulness. I love mindfulness. I love the app Headspace and Calm. I use them. I think they can be incredibly helpful. But I do want you to know there is a difference between mindfulness and I would say prayerfulness. And I think the difference between prayer and mindfulness is that mindfulness tends to direct yourself to yourself, whereas prayer directs yourself to your God. Does that make sense? Mindfulness sort of calms you to direct yourself to yourself, which can be helpful, but prayer directs yourself to your God. And I don't know about you, I've not figured out how to overcome myself by myself yet. Have you? I need something beyond myself, bigger than myself, and that's what prayer does. It centers my heart on God. And that's what David does. But it's anything but a linear process. So those who think prayer is always up and to the right, David is about to turn that all upside down. He says this, he says, "Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame." What's David doing here? He's remembering God's works in the past. He's reminding himself, he's like, okay, this is really hard to believe, but God, you came before then. You're going to come through again. You provided then. I want to believe that you're going to provide again. You saved me then. Like you're going to save me again. Like I'm trying to believe that you're good, even though life right now doesn't look very good. Now, some of you are like, well, David just makes that look so easy. Good for David. It only took him 3 verses to get to that point. I've been doing this for 3 years. What's going on? And you need to understand, though, it's not easy for David. It's not easy for you. It's not easy for me. It's probably not easy for any of us, because check this out. David, after just saying, God, you provided for me then, you're going to provide for me again. And the very next verse, here's what David says. "But I am a worm, I'm not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people." He's a little extra, right? He's a little dramatic. So David, I need you to see this. This is important. David literally goes from, you are enthroned as the Holy One of Israel. You came for me, came through then, you'll come through again. You save people. And in the next verse, he goes, oh, I'm a worm. I'm not even a man. I'm despised by the people. Does it feel like emotional whiplash? Like, what is going on here? Because it is. Like, we're getting a live streamed view of David's emotional, mental, and spiritual roller coaster that he's on. And if we're honest, it probably sounds like some of us sometimes. I mean, let's be real. How many times have we left Sunday morning, you're like, God, you're so good. And then Sunday night, you're like, where are you, God? You've abandoned me. The door didn't open. Like, so quickly can we go from trusting God to wondering if he's even there. And my point is, it's part of the process. And I don't think God is standing there going like, seriously? Get it together. Like, what is going on? No, I think what God does, I think he's like, oh, this is a roller coaster. And he's like, let's get on this together. You know, if you want a spirituality that's just always up and to the right, you're going to be really let down. Spiritual growth is a whole lot more like a roller coaster. And sometimes on the ride called life, it tosses you upside down a couple times before it brings you right back up again. But Jesus is with you every step of the process if you'll invite him into it. And what I love about David doing right here in this point, he didn't seem to believe that God was worried about his whiplash in the sense of like he was trying to avoid it. Instead, he invites God into that point of processing. So how do we pray emotionally healthy prayers? First, we say, God, here's my pain. Here's my sorrow. Here's my struggle. Here's my suffering. And then we say, let's get on the roller coaster, Jesus. And you wade through the contradictions and the emotions and the zigs and the zags. And you allow that to be a part of the process. Some of you think God is frustrated with you because you're not where you think you need to be. You might be frustrated with you, but I want to tell somebody today, God's not frustrated with you. That might be just for one of you. It's not even in my notes. Andy will confirm it. He's got my notes back there. It's not in my notes. Because maybe there's one of you right now, you're coming to this place and you carry so much shame because you think God is like, why aren't you here yet? And God's not, he's not pointing to where you need to go. He's standing right where you are, and he's walking with you every step of the way. Emotionally healthy prayer starts with pain, then processing, and then it moves to the third, which is prayer. And prayer is that point where you turn to God for help. This is the point that we all probably hope we get to, that point where we come to the end of ourselves and we admit, I cannot overcome myself by myself. I need you, God, and I surrender all that I am. And David finally arrives there in verse 11. He says, do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there's no one to help. See, one thing I want you to see here is that it took David 11 verses to get to a place of being ready to actually ask God for help. Like getting to a place of trust and dependence on God, which is the heart of prayer, I believe, ultimately, because it's all about doing life with God. But it took David a while to get there. It was a journey for David. A journey with ups and downs and zigs and zags. where every emotion was screaming at him, sometimes all at once. But eventually, David got where he needed to be. I want to tell somebody today, you're going to get where you need to be. You're going to get where you need to be. You might just need to write that down as a proclamation for your own life. I'm going to get where I need to be. Turn to the person next to you and tell them, you're going to get where you need to be. You're going to get where you need to be. You're going to get where you need to be. There's going to be a point where you will get to that place where you say, God, I trust you with everything that is in me. My hope is in you. My life is in you. My future is in you. I surrender all that I am to you. It's a part of emotionally healthy prayer. But it doesn't start there. It starts with pain, progresses to processing, and then eventually becomes prayerful surrender to God. And then you start going on the other side of this emotionally healthy prayer journey, and that is through proclamation. And proclamation is where you affirm faith and you affirm your trust in God. So by the time David turns to God for help, David is starting to sound like a new person. Remember how he started. My God, why have you forsaken me? I am a worm, not a man, despised by all people. And see now how his posture is beginning to change. He moves from prayer to proclamation. In verse 23, he says, I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. So now David's in a completely different headspace. Now he's announcing how good and awesome God is. And the man who started this prayer by saying, God, why have you abandoned me, is now declaring that God is actually with him every step of the way. And here's what I think is so important to understand. David's life didn't change at this point. We get no indicator that everything David was hoping to happen would have happened, that his circumstances changed, that his context changed. But instead, something within him had changed. And see, if you want to know how to have peace in your life, you got to figure out, how do we have peace that transcends our circumstances? As long as you get peace from your circumstances, you will always be one bad circumstance away from your peace falling apart. But there's actually a way where you can live your life with a peace that is bigger than your circumstances, but that is a peace that can only happen internally, never externally. That if your peace is in how much you make, you'll lose it as soon as you lose your job. If your peace is in your title, then you'll lose it if you ever lose that title. If your peace is in your marriage, you'll lose your peace when your marriage goes through a tough time. If your peace is in a relationship with your partner, then your peace will always be dependent on the state of your relationship at that point in time. But there is a way to have peace that transcends context and circumstance. It happens on the inside. Something where you arrived at this place where you say, God, I trust you, I surrender to you, and I believe that even when it doesn't feel like you're with me, you are actually with me. See, there's power in your words. The scriptures in Proverbs actually say, if you look for good, you'll find it. If you look for evil, you'll find it. In other words, what that could also mean is you get what you expect, or you'll get what you talk the most about. Isn't it funny that I've, and probably you, have never met a person who has overcome bitterness by talking about how bitter they are all the time? That you've never loved your spouse more by talking negatively about them all the time? That you've never found hope by talking about how life is so hopeless? The Hebrews had this interesting concept. They believe that your words create worlds. Which, of course, is why Genesis, the creation poem, the very first book of the Bible, how does God create the world? He says with his words, let there be light, and boom, there was light. Why? Because there was always this intimate connection between the words you say and the world you create. And what you say the most is the world you're likely creating and leading your life into. So it makes you wonder, like, if you can create such a destructive world with your words, I wonder how good of a world you could create with your words. I wonder what kind of future you could create if you just began saying, this hope that I long for, it's going to happen. This divorce is not final, is not my destiny. That failure is not final. This anxiety, this depression is not going to be the defining part of my life. That this wound and this bitterness is going to heal. That I am not always going to be addicted to this. I am going to be free. My marriage is going to be okay. I am going to find peace whether or not I get married or not. Like, what would happen if you began speaking out with your words the future that you want to create? I just dare you to do it for the next 30 days. I dare you to replace toxic negativity with words of hope and positivity. I just dare you to do it because I doubt any of you are going to be like, man, that just made me worse. Ugh, positivity. Like, there's something about the words you say. Don't underestimate how powerful your words are. And an emotionally healthy prayer, there must come a point in time where you actually begin to proclaim what you believe God is going to do in your life. And the last is this, it's peace, which is what we all want, right? Who here could use a little peace? Like, we all need some peace. We all want to get to this final stage where we're settled, where we're calm, where we're expectant. And it is a part of emotionally healthy prayer when we can sit in gratitude in the peace of God over our lives as they are and the life that is yet to come. But this peace that we see David experience had nothing to do with the world around him changing. It had everything to do with that internal world within him being transformed. And so David spends several more verses talking about God's power, faithfulness, and love. And by the end, you see David, he's in a completely different headspace and heart space than he was when he first began and said God had totally abandoned him. See, these 5 progressions of prayer are pain, processing, prayer, proclamation, and peace. I believe all of these steps are key to emotionally healthy prayer. But here's the catch. You don't get to skip any of these steps if you want emotionally healthy prayer. You know, I've done a lot of work on my mental and emotional health over these last couple years. And you know what I had to learn? I don't get to skip steps. My therapist would be like, Travis, dude, you do this thing where like you feel pain and then you just like you cut it off from your brain to your heart. You don't want to feel it, so you just shove it all over here. I was skipping the pain step. And I actually needed to invite it in and allow it a seat at the table. See, you don't get to skip a step. In fact, I would argue that most people that I've met that struggle with prayer, it's because of one of 2 reasons. They've tried to skip a step, or they're stuck at a step. They've tried to skip a step. So, for example, this happens all the time in churches, that we move straight to proclamation. God, you're going to do good things. God, my future is full of hope. God, you're going to make it all make sense. And you never yet actually address the pain in the first place. And you never actually invite Jesus into that space where you need to process what you went through, process the struggle you've endured, process the trauma that you have witnessed or experienced in your life. And as a result, you went straight to proclamation, skipping pain, processing, and prayer. And then you're like, well, why do I still feel like garbage on the inside? Because you skipped some steps. And you actually might need to go back to step 1 and just say, God, oh my God, here's the pain. Here's the wounds. Here's where I'm like actually still angry at you, God. And go into that space of processing. Or for other people, they don't skip steps, but they do get stuck at 1. And so I see this often where someone will go to processing, they'll bring the pain, they'll bring pain into their prayer, and then they'll process, and they never move beyond processing. It's always talking about what happened to them, what fell apart, what broke, what prayer wasn't answered, what pain you endured. It's always talking about what happened, and you're so busy processing that you never get to that point of just saying, God, I can't carry this anymore. I just need you to have it all. And you enter into prayerful surrender, kind of like we did this morning. For some of us, you're just holding on with a clenched fist. You refuse to move beyond processing. You're stuck at a step. And if there's anything I've learned in my spirituality, my emotional and mental health, you don't get to skip steps. And you don't get necessarily control how fast you go through the process. But you do have control to identify where you are and invite Jesus into that space, because Jesus doesn't just meet you at peace. I think sometimes we think we think that Jesus, let's just say this is peace. Like you're over there, Zach, you're, hey, how are you? I think for some of us, we think prayer works like this. Like Jesus is like, hey, I'm here. I'm waiting for you when you're ready to get here. Peace is awesome. If you just trust me more, you'd probably be here by now, Zach. But, let me know when you get ready. And so we pray longer and louder and more intense. And when really prayer really is like this. Zach, grab your hand. Prayer is like this. It's like God being like, what's hurting you? What's going on? Your nose, I know. Oh, yeah, let's process that. You're pretty angry at me, huh? Not now. Okay. All right. And we go around, and sometimes process is more like this. We're just like going all over the place. This is not my notes either. And you're just circles and circles. God's like, hey, at my therapy retreat I went to, some people, I can tell you about it. It was awesome. But like with my therapist, one thing we did, she just grabbed my hand and we just walked. We just talked. I still get emotional thinking about it, to be honest. Because there was just something about allowing God into that space of processing. Where I was like, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. I'm all over the place. But then eventually we get to hear prayer. And it's like this point where you go like, God, I'm ready. You ready to hand it over? Ready to trust? Yeah. Done trying to overcome yourself by yourself? I'm here for that too. I'm here for that too. Hey, how about we go over here? Man, I got hope for you. I got plans for you. I got purposes. Do you see it, Zach? Do you see it? Man, I see it. God's going to restore you. God's going to heal you. God's going to put you back together. God, and all of a sudden you begin, sometimes you say it before you see it. But what's funny is that as you say it, you begin to see it. That faith, in a lot of ways, it's sometimes clinging to a reality that is greater than the present reality you're in. Sometimes people will call it crazy, but sometimes it's just you saying, no, I'm not gonna be trapped back there. And God's like, yeah, I'm here for it. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? And then we eventually get to this place of peace where I'm here with you because I walked with you every step of the way. Can I tell you, this is what prayer, emotionally healthy prayer, looks like. Not God yelling at you at the finish line, but God joining you on the starting line and walking with you every step of the way. Can we just give Zach some love? And if you want to come up. That was totally improvised. Thanks, Zach. I just think some of us need to get that visual in our hearts, though. Because you got the God who's yelling at you at the finish line. That's not God. Why is the point of prayer is with? He's the God of with. He's with you. In the pain, in the processing, in the prayer, in the proclamation, and in the peace. So here's my question. I'll just end with this. Where are you? Where are you, if we can put that circle that on the screen, Andy, like, where are you? I mean, for some of you, you haven't even entered the cycle yet because you've got pain and trauma and wounds that you're just like, I can relate because I did this. Like, I'm just trying to overpower. I'm just trying to be strong enough. And you actually just got to get to that point where you say, God, here's my pain. Maybe for some of you, that's where you are. Maybe others of you, you've done the pain part, but you've not done the processing. So you've brought your pain, but you've not created a space where you can get on the roller coaster a little bit and allow all the feelings, even the contradicting ones, to have a place. And maybe for some of you, you've been processing for a long time. It's time to start surrendering through prayer. And God's like, yep, yep, that happened. Yep, that's awful. Yep, that's a wound. And not an apathetic yep. I need you to hear me. This is a heart full of grace that God has. He's like, oh, yes, I'm so sorry. So let's move forward. Maybe for some of you, it's crossing that line and saying, I'm so done. Maybe some of you, the prayer you need to pray right now is, I'm so done trying to do it myself. Good, you're entering the next phase, prayer, surrender. And maybe for some of you, you've been surrendering, and now it's time to start believing again for the hope that God has for you. To start seeing what God has for you and actually speaking it out. And you're like, that's crazy, I don't feel it. That's fine. What if you just kept talking about it till you did? I found sometimes we wait to feel our way into action, but sometimes you got to act your way into feeling. You know what I'm talking about? You're like, I'll do it when I feel like it. That's a great way to get stuck processing. It's a great way to get stuck in surrender. But sometimes you just got to take a step out and be like, nope, this will not be my story. Hope is my story. Grace is my story. Truth is my story. Love is my story. Healing is my story. I was abused, but I'm not going to die a victim. I was wounded, but I'm going to die healed. I will not die in this place. I see what God is creating. For some of you, you just got to start speaking it out. Maybe every morning you look in the mirror and you say, my life is full of hope, purpose. I am not a broken thing. I'm a healing thing. And God's going to get me right where I need to be. And then for others of you, maybe actually like God's brought you through this and you've yet to actually just say thank you. And like be grateful for what God has got you through and to rest in the peace of God. And maybe that's the next step for some of you today. So my invitation over these next few minutes is, how do you get through all these steps in the next 2 minutes? The invitation is, where are you in this? And what does it look like for you to invite Jesus into that space? What does it look like for you to allow the entire journey to belong and to invite Jesus to walk you through it every step of the way? Can we pray?